You ever get that feeling, you're trying to figure out what's going on in the world, but, well, the places you usually trust for information, they just don't feel as solid anymore.
Mm-hmm. Like the reliable voices are kind of fading out.
Exactly. If that rings a bell, well, you're definitely in the right place today.
It's something we hear quite a bit, actually.
Yeah,
And it really points to this pretty big shift in how we find news, how we understand it.
totally. And today on the deep dive, we're going to tackle that head on. What's really happening with journalism? One of you sent us this fascinating article.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's called Autistic Perspectives, The Death of Journalism in the West by James Horrocks. And it's dated May 2025, so it's got this really timely feel.
Huh. Interesting title. Autistic Perspectives.
Right. It brings a really, maybe unexpected angle to this whole thing.
Okay. So our mission today, it isn't just to, list the problems facing traditional news. It's more about digging into why these changes are happening.
And exploring maybe some surprising ways new voices are starting to cut through the noise.
Exactly. Some encouraging stuff, potentially.
Okay, let's get into it. The article, it starts by painting this pretty bleak picture, doesn't it, about the big news organizations.
Yeah, it's pretty stark. Talk about major cuts. The Los Angeles Times, down 20% of their journalists.
20%, wow.
And Time Magazine losing 15%. Then you've got similar stories hitting Sports Illustrated, Business Insider, Condé Nast. It's widespread.
That's really serious, like fundamentally serious.
It is. And the article zeroes in on the core reason, money, or, well, the lack of it from old sources.
The internet effect.
Right. The internet basically just swept away the traditional advertising and classified revenue, the stuff that kept these places afloat for decades.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Newspaper classifieds, Craigslist and others just took that over. And online ads are a whole different beast dominated by tech giants.
Exactly. So that river of money just dried up for most traditional outlets.
So the consequence, the article argues, is that these familiar names, these sources we kind of grew up with, they might actually disappear.
Which raises that huge question, right? If they go, where do we find that deep, trustworthy reporting?
Mm-hmm.
The article does note, a few big players, like the New York Times, they've managed to pivot to subscriptions, somewhat successfully.
Right, but that's the exception, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
That model just isn't viable for most news organizations. They don't have that national or even global brand recognition.
Okay, so it feels like this huge financial crunch is kind of recent, driven by tech. But then the article hits us with some history.
Yeah, this was interesting. It says this isn't just an internet age problem. There's this long history of wealthy people owning news outlets to push their own agendas.
Goes way back, huh?
Way back.
Yeah.
It's kind of fascinating to realize that the idea of a totally independent, purely objective news source, well, it's always been more of an ideal maybe than a constant reality.
Right.
The article points out that even in the earliest days, colonial America, Europe, wealthy merchants, politicians, they often started papers specifically to sway public opinion.
Wow. It mentions Alexander Hamilton, one of the U.S. founding fathers.
Yeah, founding the New York Evening Post back in the late 1700s.
And why? To promote the Federalist Party and actively attack his rivals.
So that sets a pattern, this idea of news being completely separate from power and influence.
Yeah.
Maybe that was never quite the full story.
It seems not, and it definitely continued. Think about the 19th, 20th centuries, the press barons.
Hearst and Pulitzer.
Exactly. Figures like William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, they built massive media empires specifically to amplify their political views.
The article mentions Hearst pushing for war coverage.
Yeah, using his papers to whip up support for expansionism. It's a stark example of that unchecked power media owners could wield.
It's a bit unsettling thinking about that level of influence, and the article draws a line straight to today, doesn't it?
It does, pointing to modern billionaire ownership. Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post in 2013, Patrick Soon-Shiong taking over the LA Times in 2018. And the worry, even if you have journalistic standards, is that the owner's worldview, their priorities, they can still shape the coverage, right? Even subtly.
That's the concern highlighted, yeah. While journalists strive for impartiality, ultimate decisions about resources, what gets covered, the overall editorial slant that often rests higher up.
And the article suggests most of us aren't really aware of how much information is still controlled by just a few very wealthy individuals.
Yeah, that consolidation of ownership is a key point.
Okay, so that context leads to another interesting bit. The start of journalism schools, I kind of assumed they were always just about, teaching how to write a news story.
Yes, but the article suggests their origin was partly a reaction against those powerful agenda-driven publishers like Hearst and Pulitzer.
Ah, okay. So the sensationalism, the lack of objectivity back then, people were getting concerned.
Exactly. There was this growing feeling that publishers were prioritizing their own agendas, maybe boosting sales with sensational stuff over accuracy.
So journalism schools, like the early ones at Missouri, Columbia, they were an attempt to professionalize things, to instill ethics.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Trying to create standards. Things like, proper sourcing, trying for fair representation, transparency, independence from those powerful owners.
And organizations like the Society of Professional Journalists helped codify those ethical guidelines.
Right. Those ideals of objectivity, nonpartisanship, they became much more established as professional norms. But, as the author points out,
That tension between billionaire ownership and journalistic independence, it never really went away.
still an ongoing challenge, yeah.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, the article brings up something I hadn't really connected to the decline, the environmental footprint of print media.
Yeah, this is another layer I found fascinating. It shows how multiple pressures are kind of converging on traditional media.
And the details are pretty stark. Newsprint takes twice the energy of copy paper.
Roughly, yeah. And a single Sunday newspaper. Just think about the whole life cycle. Harvesting trees, printing, distribution. It can generate 5 times its own weight in greenhouse gases.
Wow, that's significant. It's ironic, isn't it? An industry based on informing the public having such a big environmental cost itself?
It is. And it's not just newspapers. The article mentions magazines, too. A study found a typical magazine issue needs something like 136 gallons of water and emits over 5 pounds of carbon.
Globally, that adds up, comparable to Portugal's annual emissions, just from magazines.
That's what the study suggested, yeah. Now, obviously, digital media has its own footprint, right? Servers, devices.
Sure, energy consumption.
Right. But the general expert consensus, according to the article, is that digital's overall climate impact is significantly less than print's.
So as sustainability becomes a bigger concern for everyone.
An environmental cost could push things further away from print, regardless of any nostalgia people might feel. Okay, so we've got the financial collapse, the history of ownership, the ethics debate, the environmental angle. Now the article starts looking forward, this idea of grassroots microjournalism.
Yeah, this is where it gets potentially hopeful, or at least different.
So this idea of really local news driven by the community itself, how would that actually work? What does it look like?
Well, the article paints this picture of community-centered news, driven maybe by volunteers or individual micro-publishers. Think kind of like Substack, but hyper-local.
Okay. So people in the community itself are gathering info.
Yeah, maybe aggregating and verifying stuff from local social media. Twitter threads, TikToks, Instagram, Nextdoor.
Using web tools, maybe AI to help fact check?
Potentially, yeah. To create this real-time picture of what's happening right there. The key emphasis is on human curation, though, preserving that community's unique voice.
It might not be as polished as, say, the LA Times used to be.
Probably not. But the argument is it could be more authentic, a more direct reflection of what people are actually talking about, what matters to them locally. And funding this, it would need new models. The article mentions things like platform co-ops, nonprofits.
Micro-subscriptions, too, maybe that value for value idea.
It feels like it could lead to deeper civic engagement, maybe, if the news is really from and for the community.
That's the potential upside, yeah. Taking out those layers of corporate ownership, distant priorities. It could foster a stronger connection, more investment in local issues. It's kind of a decentralization, putting power back into community hands.
Okay, that sounds potentially quite revolutionary, but what about all the journalists working now, the ones losing jobs in traditional media? Where do they fit in this picture?
That's a huge question. And isn't there a risk here, too? Like quality control, fact-checking, without the structure of a newsroom.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. We'll get to some of the challenges later. But first, on the journalists themselves, the article suggests several ways they could adapt. Their skills are still crucial.
Like verification, knowing how to source, how to tell a story fairly.
Exactly. So they could become curators for these local hubs, using their expertise to vet information. Their fact-checking skills would be vital in this more decentralized landscape.
That makes sense. They could also strike out on their own, right? Personalized newsletters, podcasts for niche audiences.
Yeah, building on their own expertise and following.
And beyond just creating content, maybe teaching. Training community members in basic journalism skills, how to spot news, verify info in this new environment.
Or coaching, consulting for these new community publishers, helping them set up shop ethically and effectively.
Right. And maybe selling bigger, in-depth pieces to larger platforms as freelancers, or using their writing skills for ghostwriting, editing books.
So the core skills, gathering info, analyzing, communicating, they're transferable. It's about finding new ways, new models to apply them.
Exactly. The structures might be changing, but the need for those skills remains.
Okay, now the article digs into the economics and ethics of traditional journalism, and it uses this term, exploitation of journalists. What's the argument there?
Yeah, the author argues that the traditional model involved what they call surplus value extraction. It's an economic concept, basically saying
That journalists created a lot of value, driving ad sales and subscriptions, but didn't see a fair share of the profits.
precisely. Publishers, shareholders, they often profited immensely from the content journalists produced, but the journalists themselves often faced low pay, job insecurity.
Yeah.
They weren't really sharing in that wealth they helped generate.
So the example is like a star investigative reporter. Their work brings in readers, maybe wins awards, boosts ad revenue.
Right. Huge value generated.
But they just get their salary. The owners reap most of the financial reward.
That's the dynamic the article describes, drawing a parallel to classical economic critiques of labor and capital. Journalism had prestige, sure, but the economics often didn't match the value created by the reporters and editors.
And these new models, like direct subscriptions on Substack or Patreon, they're trying to fix that imbalance.
That's the idea. By cutting out the middle layers, journalists can connect directly with their audience and maybe capture more of the value their work creates.
And the author believes the collapse of the old system wasn't just financial, but fundamentally ethical.
Yeah, framing it as a crisis of ethics, arguing the old system was inherently exploitative in that way.
Okay, which brings us right up to the final section, that May 2025 update, reflecting on how things looked 2 years after the initial piece.
And it sounds like the implosion of legacy media only sped up.
Yeah, that's the stark picture here. More consolidation. Gannett, for example, layoffs becoming routine, the LA Times looking more like a PR firm.
Oh.
And that weird story about Sports Illustrated trying AI-generated content before just shutting down again.
Wow. Yeah, that really speaks volumes about the desperation, maybe, and the chaos.
But, okay, amidst all that decline, the author sees something else happening, a big shift in who is telling the story.
Right. Not the old guard, but writers who are neurodivergent, queer, trans, multiply marginalized, finding their footing on platforms like Substack, Patreon, Ghost, private newsletters.
And the point isn't just representation, is it? It's that these voices bring fundamentally different perspectives, telling different kinds of stories.
Exactly. It's potentially leading to a richer, more complex understanding of things.
And the article stresses these voices always existed. What's new is the infrastructure, fragile as it might be, allowing them to publish without asking permission from the traditional gatekeepers.
Right. And their writing often doesn't fit that old mold. It might be longer, more personal, more emotional maybe, less worried about that detached objectivity.
Too long, too tangled, too emotional. The article lists things like too autistic, too trans, too real.
And because of that, the author argues they face new challenges, algorithmic ones.
Like shadow banning, deranking, opaque moderation rules that seem to hit voices challenging the status quo hardest.
Yeah. Content gets flagged for naming structural violence, or an essay on autistic communication gets marked unprofessional. Newsletters just vanish from search results.
Which leads to this really provocative claim that the establishment's fear of these platforms isn't really about fighting misinformation.
What is it about, then, according to the author?
It's about losing control of the narrative, losing the power to be the sole decider of what counts as news, whose voice gets heard.
Wow. Okay, there's that quote you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's powerful. We are not supposed to be narrators. We are supposed to be subjects. Quiet ones, case studies. But here we are, writing, publishing, connecting, not always polished, but always ours.
That really sums up the shift, doesn't it?
It does. And the author calls it not just technological, but ontological, meaning it changes the very being, the what of journalism.
Because the who is changing. And these writers think differently, maybe don't separate fact from meaning or emotion from rigor in the same way.
Their work isn't just takes, the article says, but tracings of harm, of hope, of systems shifting in real time.
And that's why, the author argues, the traditional powers want these voices contained, kept in the margins.
Seems to be the argument. But the piece ends on this really strong note. There's no going back. The real change is happening in these individual connections, rejecting that old myth of objectivity that was often used to silence people.
That's a powerful message.
Right.
Especially, as you said, when you see the rise of propaganda filling the vacuum left by collapsing legacy media.
Yeah, the lines blurring between opinion and policy, that's concerning. But the author frames this whole thing as a story about narrative capture and the refusal to be captured.
A liberatory moment, potentially, where the bylines aren't just theirs, they're ours.
Wow. Okay, so let's circle back to our listeners' initial curiosity about where the reliable information is going.
It seems the death of traditional journalism,
Hmm.
it's not really an endpoint. It's more like a really messy, complex, maybe even chaotic transformation.
Exactly. And the key takeaway seems to be this emerging power. The power of individuals, especially marginalized voices, to shape the story in this new decentralized landscape.
There are definitely challenges, real concerns about quality, manipulation, we touched on those. But there's also this potential, this opportunity for something more diverse, maybe more authentic, to grow.
Which leaves us and you, the listener, with something to think about.
Yeah. What does it really mean for information to be less polished, maybe, but potentially more authentic, more tied to lived experience and community?
And what role can we all play in supporting these emerging voices? How do we help ensure that the information ecosystem that comes next is diverse, truthful, and actually serves people?
A lot to chew on there.